One person's story can change everything. Consider the impact of a single moment, like when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Or what about that photo of the man who stood all alone before 4 Chinese tanks in Tiananmen Square? Hello there, this is Bradley, and you're listening to Psych Everywhere, a podcast by Psi Chi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. For this show, distinguished guests weigh in on applying psychology findings to a diverse range of contemporary issues and bettering your life. Whether true or entirely fictional, such as a Shakespearean play, stories clearly have incredible powers. But what are those powers? Well, they have the ability to change what we believe or lead us to care about something new. They can bring us together, or they can tear us apart. If we binge enough stories, can they even change how our brains receive and process information? In this episode, I have the unique privilege of interviewing Dr. Ali Mattu. Many listeners probably already know him well because he hosts the ever-popular Psych show on YouTube. So that show, it has 164,000 subscribers, so it's a little bit ahead of us. And it has like 160 creative episodes available on topics like mental health, anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder. Among many other accomplishments, Dr. Mattu has worked with Netflix, BuzzFeed, HBO, and co-hosted a recent PBS series called Self-Evident. And that series explores what it means to be American through stories of people's challenges and triumphs. Here's something you might not know. Dr. Mattu is also a board member of the Story Collider, which is an organization that helps people tell their true personal stories about science. And that is our topic for today. Dr. Mattu, welcome to the show. I am seriously so excited to have you on here today.
Bradley, I'm so excited to be here too. I love Psych, and I have been a big supporter of you all since I was an undergrad. I'm a big fan, and it's an honor to be here and part of this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah. We've been planning this one for quite a while to get it ready and find a date that worked for both of us.
It was probably more on me of the difficulty in finding the date, but I'm so glad we made it happen this season.
Yeah, so I thought I'd start with kind of a personal story.
Yeah.
I'd say that my favorite story that really changed my life is, cheesily enough, Jurassic Park, the book.
Oh, one of my favorites.
I saw you had some videos about Jurassic, or one of the newer Jurassic World films. So I thought you might like that. I read the book when I was in like 3rd grade. There were like intestines in people's hands. I mean, it had me.
Yeah.
I couldn't stop reading it. And there was so much science in that book. And I knew I was learning, but I, for the first time, didn't really care because the story was so incredible. And so my first kind of fun question is, what is a story that has changed your life or how you see the world?
Well, Jurassic Park is a near and dear one to my heart. It's the first time I remember seeing a movie in the movie theater where I really felt transported. Like for those 2 hours, I was in a different place, a different land, and everything outside did not exist. I was at Jurassic Park. So it's a movie that I love. I wouldn't say it's a story that changed the direction of my life or changed my life in the way it sounds like it did for you. The clear story that comes to mind with that question is an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation called Tapestry. And so this is an episode where our captain, Captain Jean-Luc Picard, played by Sir Patrick Stewart, he's given an opportunity to go back in time and correct a regret from when he was younger. And he goes back and he does that. And he comes back to the present and he realizes that everything has completely changed, that this big mistake he made when he was young, it led to post-traumatic growth. It led to him understanding how important life is. And without that lesson, the direction of his life was far different. He's not a captain anymore. He's kind of meandered in his life. He hasn't achieved all the things that he did. And then ultimately that episode ends with him wanting to go back in time and make that mistake again. What that episode taught me is as long as we learn from our mistakes, then they're not really failures at all. They're That's how we grow. That's how humans grow. From the moment we're babies and we're learning how to walk, you can't learn how to walk without stumbling, without falling down on your knees, all this sort of stuff. I'm a dad now. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and when I took her to the pediatrician last, she was, doing the pediatrician was doing her whole checkup, and she's like, lots of great bruises on the legs, and I'm like, is that bad? And she's like, no, this is what we want. We want to see that your daughter is exploring, falling down, challenging herself, growing. And it reminded me of that episode of Star Trek again about growth. And so that lesson, Bradley, stuck with me throughout my life, like into middle school and high school and well beyond. And it's something I always come back to. It's something I've shared with all the people I've worked with, is as long as we learn from these experiences, it's not a failure. This is how we grow.
Star Trek has so many great lessons. I'm actually watching that show right now.
Oh my
I'm
gosh.
not that far, I don't think. I'm just starting maybe season 3. I don't
Okay,
believe I've
you're
seen that
getting
one,
into
but
the good stuff.
yeah, it's getting better finally. It
Yeah,
really
for
is.
beginning is a little, but yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. I want to open this up to listeners too. If a story has changed your life, go ahead and share that with me on Twitter. Just tag at Psych Podcast or use hashtag Psych everywhere and tell me about stories that have changed your life. I'd like to share those and see what you think.
I would
Um,
love to
yeah.
hear from the audience as well. Because I think we all have a story like that. We all have something that we have watched or read or experienced or even heard from family. I recently for I recently heard the story from a family member that completely changed my view of myself in a very positive way. So for most of my life, I've not liked my nose. And I felt like my nose, it was like big or like shaped weird, all that sort of stuff, right? And my cousins would always, this is what friends and family sometimes do, is they figure out, they're very good behavioralists, and they know how to get a reaction out of you and what's going to consistently get a reaction. So my cousins would always make fun of my nose because they knew I was sensitive about it, and I would give them a reaction because I had a hard time ignoring that. Anyways, long story short, I was sharing this with another cousin of mine, not one who made fun of me. And she said, well, I've learned where that nose in our family, where it came from. And it came from our great grandmother. And I heard the story from her about my great grandmother that I never heard before, that my dad never shared with me. And it's a story about how my great grandfather died when he was very young. And I think he was in his 20s, and he had two sons with my great grandmother. But then when he passed away, my great grandmother was kind of raising these two boys, and people in the local village sort of came after her for all the property she inherited. And she disguised herself as a man, hid her two boys in this, I guess, a horse-drawn carriage, I don't know, went to the neighboring village and waited there until she was able to get enough support, and then came back to reclaim this land. It's a little bit of a Mulan kind of story.
Hmm.
And this woman, she was like the first one in our family who had this nose. We have the exact same nose. It's her that we got this from. And she kind of saved our family line. And I heard the story, and it completely changed the way I see myself now. Like literally the way I see myself. Now when I look in the mirror and I see my nose, it's not, oh man, my nose is so big. It's this, I am part of my great grandmother's legacy, a woman who completely saved our family. And
Yeah.
that's what I see now when I see my nose. And that was a story. A story is what
Yeah.
did that.
Well, how did you get interested in telling these short psychology stories on your YouTube show?
So it goes back to being a teacher of psychology. So I've taught a lot of intro psych And I love doing that. That was part of the reason why I got my doctorate. I think I actually got my doctorate mostly because I just love psychology and I wanted to find ways of sharing it with other people. And at first I thought that was going to be teaching psychology. And so when I was teaching a lot of intro psych, I constantly started experimenting with my classes and doing lots of different things. And also, I was researching a lot about what are effective ways of teaching people. And I kept coming across a few different things. One, on the lecture side, I learned a lot about how what lectures are good for and what they're not good for. And lectures are really good at answering questions and also clarifying information. And some of the best lectures are storytelling based. And so I learned a lot about that. And then I learned about other skills, like some of the best ways of teaching people are collaborative learning methods, active learning methods, where students are really involved in the process. So I learned a lot about that. And then I kind of developed this collection of stories that I share to emphasize certain key concept in psychology. So whether it's research methods and teaching people about mesmer and where mesmerized comes from, and some of the early ways in which stuff like that was debunked, or teaching people about how learning works and how my mom developed a lifelong fear of large trucks because of this accident that we were involved in when I was young. I developed these stories that really make it easy to understand the psychological concepts I was teaching. And then when I started my YouTube channel, it was just a natural extension of, okay, keep doing that, because the feedback I got from students is that was the stuff that was most memorable, were these stories. And that's kind of where all that comes from. And just going farther back, one of the other big formulative experiences I had growing up was, I grew up as a kid who was socially anxious. And then I took public speaking in high school because not to overcome my fears, but because I thought it was an easy A. I was just going to study famous public speeches. I had no idea I would have to give these speeches. And then it was terrifying. And I didn't drop out of the class, because to drop out of the class meant I would have to ask the teacher for permission to drop, and I was too scared to ask her. So long story short, I learned a lot about how do you capture an audience's attention and how do you hold that attention through storytelling when I did public speaking. And then later I joined the speech and debate team. So that stuff has just it's been a part of my life since I was a teenager, I would say.
I've noticed that you often tie your videos not only to a personal story, but to a popular release, like The Last
Mm.
Jedi or again, Jurassic World. But why do you think, because I don't see this very often, why do you think researchers and scientists often fail to implement stories like this into the science?
That's a good question. What I've learned about psychologists and researchers by extension, scientific researchers, is the data is usually the story.
Mhm.
So a lot of what we learn in grad school is how to get really good at critical thinking, at the scientific method, at applying those methods to the specific niche area that we're focusing on. So for me, it really became about anxiety and body focused repetitive behavior disorders like hair pulling disorders, skin picking, stuff like that. That's really what I focused on. And I got really good at asking research based, scientific based questions related to all that stuff. And if you're doing research, then the whole story is your data. Is what did you find? What didn't you find? Does this conflict with what other people have found and what their data has shown? Does it resonate with that? What are open ended questions? If you go to a psychology conference, that is what all the panels are really about. Like, hey, we had this question. Here's what we found. Here's what we think. What do you think? That's like most scientific panels, right? And if you're really interested in that data, and if you are really interested in that niche, then that is well more than enough to capture and hold your attention. The problem is if you don't have the curse of knowledge here, if you don't have all of that knowledge already, it's very hard to try to understand and follow that stuff. And what I mean by curse of knowledge, it's not my term. A lot of other people have coined this already. Steven Pinker, I think, talks about it a lot. The idea of the curse of knowledge is when you know a lot about something, it's really hard to remember what it's like to not know anything about it. So, for example, we know what the moon is, but we can't really remember what it's like to not know what the moon is, to look up and be like, what is that thing? Is that cheese? Is that just like, a scratch in the sky? Like none of us can remember what it's like to not know about the moon. Similarly for me, like I can't remember what it's like to not know what a neuron is or how the nervous system works or how anxiety functions. And so for a lot of us who know a lot about these topics, it's very easy to think that the data will tell the story of what we want to share. But if you don't know much about the subject, it's very hard to get bought into lectures or learning or all that kind of stuff. Why I think pop culture is such a beautiful solution to this is because we have to bridge new information with existing information. And pop culture, TV shows, video games, movies, YouTube, TikToks, they are so the language of how we discuss much of what's going on in the modern world. So why not latch on to the way people talk about what's happening and use that to help explain psychology?
Is there any research on storytelling and its effectiveness, things like that?
Oh, there's so many cool findings. Like one of the things that really inspired me is when I was trying to understand literacy a little bit better, like what helps people to learn complicated information. And there's pretty clear research here about if information in a book is presented in a more of a narrative, more of a story, versus if it's presented as more as information and just more traditional curriculum,
Mhm.
it is much easier to learn and remember the story-based information than it is the more traditional textbook method. And I don't want to diss textbooks. A lot of the best textbooks out there have a lot of great storytelling in them. But when you present information in a story, it is easier to learn and digest. You can have a lower reading level for it. You don't need as much background information. When you tell a story, it simplifies the experience. It simplifies what the attention should be on, what you should be focusing, what you should remember. Now, in most cases, that's the best way to introduce this stuff. Storytelling has its downsides, which I'm sure we're going to get into, but it is much easier to digest. And then when it comes to what makes an effective story versus not effective story, you kind of mentioned earlier on about my work with the Story Collider. And one of the things that we talk about a lot with scientists at Story Collider is the idea of transportation. The more details that you can put into a story that help to transport a person through space and time, connecting back to Star Trek, it helps person to really be in that frame of mind of the story. So one of the things that I often tell people if they're trying to improve on their storytelling craft is including sensory details can be such a big help. Like what it sounded like when you're in that experience, what it smelled like. Smell is such a cool sense because it's the fastest sense in terms of it has the least number of neurons from point of reception to point of processing in your brain. It's such a short distance from your nose to the olfactory bulb where this stuff is processed, and it's also located really close to your memories, so it smells very easily activate different memories. So I always tell people, like, yeah, include what it sounded like, what it looked like, and if you can, what it smelled like. Put that detail in there that helps people to be transported in the story and to really feel like we're there. Our brains are so good at imagining different experiences. Like imagination is the next best thing to reality. And the more you can trigger that imagination, really feel like the person's transported, the more effective that story is going to be at either um, teaching the lesson that you want it to teach or helping people to really empathize with you. More cool research that's come out more recently when it comes to a lot of the partisanship we have right now and a lot of the divides we have right now. We're more likely to create empathy across divisions if people tell the story of not only why these issues matter to us, but um, if you tell a story about how they've been related to you trying to overcome harm or stay safe, those things can really enhance our ability to have empathy for one another. So, whether it's about learning, whether it's about empathy and crossing divides, there's a lot of really good research around why storytelling is so effective. It goes back to how we have communicated complex information over generations and generations. It's been through storytelling. There's a reason why stories are a big part of pop culture. There is a reason why humans have been telling stories for thousands of years. It's the primary way we have taught morals and lessons and ethics and information to the next generation.
Wow. I've heard many times people telling you, when you tell a story, make sure to include the senses like smell, but I've never heard an actual kind of neuro perspective about why. That was awesome.
Yeah, it's that's why I always go with smells. The other little secret about storytelling is specific details can often evoke a lot of schema here. So if I say a story like, I was walking down a street in New York City. All right, well, it's a little specific. There's New York City, but if I say I was walking down Fifth Avenue, it's even better because
Mhm.
there's a spreading activation that occurs in your mind of all the memories, the schemas related to New York, related to Fifth Avenue, and boom, you're there. And it's a difference between saying like I was lying on a beach versus I was lying on a beach in Maui. Having more specifics, it's this idea of like a Velcro. Velcro has all these hooks. And when you're telling a story, you want to create as many hooks as possible to activate those different memories, to activate the senses, to hold someone's attention. So the more specific you can make it, the more sensory you can make it, more likely you're going to hold someone's attention and actually make them feel that experience of transportation.
So you mentioned earlier that we'd talk about potential for harm. Let's
Yeah.
definitely do that with stories. What kind of occurs to me at first thought is, when you hear a story, it's kind of easy to assume that that must apply to everyone, and I'm sure that's not always the case. What are some other kinds of harm?
Yeah, well, the one of the problems here is they simplify a lot.
Mhm.
So especially when you're teaching, when you're trying to teach a concept or information, stories are good at simplifying, but sometimes the messages are not very simple. If it could be something as seemingly straightforward as how the synapse works, how two neurons communicate with each other. People talk about like the lock and key analogy to that, and you can kind of tell a story related to that. But it's also such a complicated process that storytelling might break down there. So a lot of times, if we tell a story, and I think about this a lot with the media I try to create. I started making videos on YouTube and I was aiming for 3 to 4 minute videos. And back then I was like, how the heck am I going to communicate anything worth anything in 3 to 4 minutes? And now I'm in a world where I'm trying to create TikToks that try to get something valuable across in like 40 seconds. I mean, I know you can go for a minute, but what a lot of people have told me is like actually make it 45 or 40 seconds. Like those work better than a minute. So when you are trying to tell a story in such a short amount of time, you're going to simplify. And this is what sometimes I've been criticized for. There was I remember a psychology teacher in a very kind way said, Ali, I use your videos in my class. I like your video on multitasking, but I gotta say, you really are simplifying a lot here. And I told him, yeah, thank you. Thanks for showing the videos. And I agree, I am. And my rationale was, but the video is not for you, it's for your students, it's for people who are new to this concept. So that's my thing with the simplification of stories. But the other part of this is, I think we saw this a lot, and we continue to see this a lot in some of the rise in nationalism that's been happening around the world, is stories can paint, but not only do they simplify, but they can also paint very simple heroes and villains. And we can tell stories about who might be causing problems for our country, for our communities. And they really simplify the quote unquote good characters and who are the quote unquote bad characters here. They can be used as a weapon for partisanship. They can be used as a weapon for violence. They can be used as a weapon for positive change. I think there's many reasons why George Floyd's murder really incited so much of a voice for social justice, not only in the United States but around the world. It was a very powerful story of injustice, the worst kind of injustice. And at the same time, we've seen what happens with, I think the greatest cautionary episode in our history is with the Nazis, who really weaponized storytelling in a way that led to the Holocaust and led to the death of so many people. It's a very powerful tool, and it can be weaponized very easily.
These stories that are geared to create divisiveness, how can we be better prepared to recognize them for what they are and disregard them?
Yeah, so this takes me back to a lot of what I've learned from social psychology. And there's a lot of stuff here. And this is the problem with psychology too, is we can say a lot about very specific situations. And then you start to move more towards how all this stuff plays out in real life. And there's just a lot of variables at play in real life. So one of the things that's popping up in my brain right now is that there's some research about um, a lot of simple stories like advertising can be very effective at persuading people if they're not really paying attention to it. And then learning some ways of paying attention and really being a critical consumer of marketing and of storytelling can be very effective at avoiding some of the ill effects of it. So, for example, one of the things that I remember Mary Fraser in her social psychology class that I had a wonderful social psychology professor, and we did a lot on pop culture. This is part of why I do what I do. I try to steal like an artist, as the expression goes, take from the best professors that I had, the best teachers that I had. And one of the things that Mary Fraser did is we would break down a lot of what's in Disney movies and what's in cartoons and what are the lessons. And the good news is I think the world's come a long way since I was a freshman in college and took that course. At the same time, there's a lot of stuff out there in pop culture that has really dated stories about gender and about race, and the themes in Disney about like historically the darker characters, literally the darker skin tone characters were the villains. Like for some reason Scar is darker than Mufasa. Like makes no sense. But we would break down these themes, and once you are a better consumer of that, it can have a bit less of an impact on you. And I try to do this with my daughter all the time to process into to be the stereotype psychologist, to really process all the stuff we're talking about or the stuff we're watching and experiencing. At the same time, one of the things that's been happening a lot more recently is storytelling that really makes you feel threatened, and to make your identity feel threatened in some way can be really mobilizing and really activating. So this is something that was really cited as a contributing factor to the January insurrection in 2021 is when a lot of people feel like their identity is threatened, that their status in culture is threatened in some way, they're more likely to act. They're more likely to break out of their day-to-day life. And you could be an active critical consumer of stories, but if you do feel like this what you're hearing, the story you're hearing does make you feel in some way that your status is being reduced, that might not be enough to kind of stop action over there. So I think over there it really falls on a lot of the platforms that we have, whether they are social media or traditional news media. What are the ways in which we are allowing these stories to be told? What are the audiences that they're reaching? Are we potentially polarizing our audiences to get more and more of the more extreme stories? This is the stuff that I think is we haven't worked out yet as a species. We've developed a lot of new technologies, but we haven't really developed all the seatbelts and the airbags to the new stuff we've created here. But I think a lot of people listening to this podcast are going to be the leaders who are going to be doing exactly that in the years to come.
Yeah. So for this next question, I already kind of believe in it that it's true, without any science though, and so I'm excited to hear what you have to say about it. I'm wondering, do you think people can select stories in order to actually intentionally alter their own emotional states, their productivity, and so forth? You think that works?
Oh, I do that all the time.
Mhm.
I think I did that last night. Yeah, I had to do a lot of cleaning and organizing, and I really don't like doing that, and it's a pretty aversive experience. So it's also can feel a bit like lonely and isolating. So I put on an episode of, what was I watching last night? Gosh, I can't remember. I was watching something on Netflix. But it in the same way that music can alter your mood and music can alter how you're feeling, stories and TV shows and movies and all of this stuff can do the exact same thing. So our relationships with real people we haven't met, like celebrities, or fictional people that do not exist, like Han Solo, these relationships are real. They call it parasocial relationships. And sometimes having a story, a TV show, a movie, reading a book, getting connected to these characters or actors or celebrities that we really care for, it can make you feel less lonely. One of the things that my wife and I were doing over the pandemic, the height of the shelter in place orders in 2020, at least for us, we're in California. One of the things we're doing was rewatching and stuff that we love, like Friends. Friends is kind of like a good go-to show for us, and I think it's because of the relationship with these characters. It's also the relationship to when we first watched this show and some of the nostalgia oriented to it or associated to it. It's also about the humor and the fun of it. So for a wide variety of reasons, these things can really help to change your mood, to change how you're feeling. And one of the things that we all needed, and continue to need during really difficult times, is absorption in activities, experiences, stories that do give you a break from the worries and rumination that we have. I've come to believe, the more I study things like metacognitive therapy, the more I have done this kind of work, the more I've begun to believe that when it comes to specifically rumination, where you're thinking over and over about why something's happened to you from the past, or worrying when you're thinking over and over about things that are happening in the future and the negative consequences of all of that. The more I believe that the best way to deal with those two particular problems is to absorb yourself in something that helps you to not give attention to those processes. So that's another way in which I think stories can be really healing, is they can disrupt the process of rumination and worrying.
You mentioned friends. Do you have any other suggestions for people who are having a difficult year, maybe because of the pandemic or family issues or anything else?
There's so much good stuff right now. It's amazing how we're living in an era where whatever streaming service you have, there is lots of award-winning, amazing, diverse stories that are now available. There's so much stuff that I've loved. I really loved Gentified or Hentified. Not sure what the right pronunciation is of that. That was a show I watched last year on Netflix, and it gave me a connection to these stories in a family that I didn't really know, and I felt like I was with this family like while I was watching it. There's oldies but goodies. Like I really love Battlestar Galactica. I talked
Yes.
about Battlestar is so good, so good. I think it has so many meaningful things that we can continue to learn from. I could list so many different things. I think Blackish is really amazing. There's just a lot of great stuff. What I would say though is it's okay to rewatch stuff that you've seen a million times, because that can help you to feel less lonely, make you feel more connected. It's more familiar. There's a lot of research that the more you read a story, the more you watch it, the more familiar it is, and the more satisfying it might actually be, because you do know what's going to happen and what you're going to.
Lost.
Yeah. Lost would be a good example. I love Lost. I'll still defend it
I will
despite the way
too.
the show ended. Um, but what I would say to extend on it is yeah, sometimes it's good to rewatch stuff if you're looking for more absorption, and if you want to break some of that rumination and some of the worrying process, then something new and very different might be really good for you. I really got into Crash Landing on You, which is a Korean drama, and I had never really seen any K dramas before. So for me, watching the show in a different language, having to read the subtitles and different TV tropes that I wasn't used to, it really pulled me in during, again, the worst parts of 2020. And so sometimes when you need to really break that cycle of thinking, you need that absorption and go for something very new and very different. The last thing I'll say about like advice on what to watch, extend upon the watching experience. Connect with a community that also really loves this thing that you love. And that's going to give you some of that social connection. It's going to give you some more people to talk with and to feel less alone too during a lot of these real tough times that we continue to go through.
Okay. Well, I think we just hit our time limit. This was fantastic.
We could spend so much more time talking
I
about
know.
this. I mean, this is my favorite stuff here.
You had so many fantastic examples. I think we've got some pretty good angles on storytelling today. Do you have anything that you'd like to add? Anything
No,
on
I
this?
just for those of you who are listening and studying psychology, my biggest tip here would be, with every concept that you're learning, connect it to a story from your own life. Connect it to some experience you've had, or connect it to a story that you love. That was the secret I had to passing all of my psychology tests. I would always connect everything I'm learning to a real world story that I experienced. And then it was way easier for me to remember that information, as opposed to just trying to cram it into my head.
All right. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Bradley. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You've just listened to another episode of Psych Everywhere. If you are a researcher or just generally passionate about sharing psychology, then I hope you'll really take this episode to heart. Work some personal stories into your efforts. Maybe tell how you became involved in your area, or just share something that surprised you along your journey. Consider using creative methods too, such as photos, videos, and so on. Real quick, here's a fun fact about our podcast. Our podcast family continues to grow with each new episode. According to the analytics, episodes have now been downloaded in more than 50 countries. So thank you for helping us to get Psych everywhere. On that note, here are 2 timely tidbits about how you can help us to spread the show. Take a moment and leave a review at Apple Podcast. Or if you're listening somewhere else, leave a review there. You can also follow us on our Twitter account. Just go to Twitter and search for @Psych Podcast. And by the way, you can also follow Dr. Mattu's YouTube show on Twitter. You guessed it, just go to @The Psych Show, or you can follow it on YouTube as well. One last thing. Did you think of a story that changed your life while you were listening to this episode? I really would like to hear about that and maybe retweet you. So share your stories on Twitter and tag us @Psych Podcast or with hashtag Psych Everywhere. If a story changed your life, perhaps it can also change the world. Okay, I think that's all for now. I'll talk to you again soon. Copyright 2021, Psi Chi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.